Today we have a very special urban agenda based on a recent Community Service Society of New York forum to discuss restructuring welfare in New York State. I'm David R. Jones, President of the Community Service Society. The forum brought together 3 guest panelists with a unique understanding of the social and fiscal ramifications of welfare reform. They are David T. Ellwood of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, who crafted President Clinton's original welfare reform plan in 1994, New York State Comptroller H. Carl McCall, and welfare issues analyst Jodie Levin-Epstein of the Center for Law and Social Policy in Washington. The following are excerpts from the forum.
The harshest critics of all are the welfare recipients. I mean, you all know this. You're out there every day, a lot of them. They talk about the humiliation, the isolation, the stigma, the frustration of the current system. They talk about a system that when you try and do the right thing, it seems like you get batted down. And of course, it's got almost no political credibility left. It was really quite something in the latter part of 1990, well, really in the early part of 1995, dealing with Democrats as well as Republicans on the Hill, how few people were willing to stand up for much of anything on the welfare area. So we've got the welfare system. And so number one, we got a tough welfare system to begin with. Second, we got a bad bill. We got a real bad bill. And it's going to be especially tough on this for a variety of reasons. We can talk about that in a moment. And then, worst of all, we got a tough labor market. It's something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, but the labor market for less skilled workers, for working class folks and so forth, is getting worse and worse. Not so much the job side, per se. Not that high unemployment, in fact, lower unemployment than we've had for quite some time, but the wage side and the benefit side. People just can't get jobs that pay enough to support a family. And so we've got these 3 forces all at the same time. As I say, it's easy to get discouraged. In fact, it's easy to get freaked out. There's a lot of misunderstanding about what's in this welfare bill. And so let me try and clear it up. This isn't one welfare bill, it's 3. 3 almost completely unrelated bills. The first part is a $58 billion cut in a whole variety of programs. The second part is dramatic changes in child support enforcement system. And the third is changing welfare from a sort of joint state-federal responsibility to one that basically amounts to revenue sharing. Those are the 3 big changes. I'm going to concentrate on the first and the third. The child support enforcement, by the way, just as an aside, is one of the few good things in this bill. This is a series of child support enforcement measures that were actually developed primarily during the Clinton administration as part of our first bill, and I appreciate the first focus. And I actually think there's some very good things there. I mean, basically what the Republicans did was pretty much adopt that as it came. And to the great credit, and I don't say this often about the current political process, the Democrats didn't crow about it, and Republicans didn't mind taking some ideas from others. It was a very bipartisan thing. All right, quickly let me talk about the cuts. $8 billion over 6 years in cuts in this welfare bill. Mostly, none of it, however, in the kind of AFPC or child care area that welfare reform is traditionally focused on. $24 billion is cuts to legal immigrants, and I emphasize legal, I assume you know it. At $24 billion over 7 years. And essentially, it's a complicated set of rules and so forth, but the bottom line is this. If you're here legally, you have a green card, a permanent resident, or whatever, you still have to pay taxes. You could still be called to serve in the armed forces, but you're not eligible for any public aid. At least not in the form of supplemental security income, SSI for the aged and disabled, and not for food stamps. Medicaid and AFPC is left to stay optional. $24 billion, of course, New York State has a very large fraction of the legal immigrants that are affected by this. Nobody knows the exact number, but looking at the figures I've seen, it looks like it's in the range of 15 to 20%, so something on the order of $3.5 billion of that amount are probably in New York State. And just in the SSI program, we're maybe talking about something like 75 to 100,000 folks. Second of all, we have big cuts in the food stamp program, $23 billion there. The biggest is a change in the way 18 to 50-year-old individuals who are childless and unemployed are treated. They are only eligible for food stamps for 3 months every 3 years, unless they are disabled. So basically that group is out of food stamps. In addition, some substantial changes in the way we do certain cost of living adjustments and a variety of things that actually in the long run make a very big difference, bringing the amount of money per meal in the food stamps program from 80 cents down to 66 cents when we adjust for changes. And that affects pretty much anybody that has any income, which is almost everybody. Finally, there's $7 billion in cuts to children with disabilities. The SSI program, 20% or so of the kids there are no longer eligible, a tightening of the rules. You know, the old system was one where the federal government would create some categories, the dependent children category of single parents or families with unemployed parents and the like. And then in addition, they could set goals and provide even resources for them for work or training or participation of that sort. And then states would set benefit levels and decide how to implement the programs and set a variety of things. And then what happened was the costs were shared. States would put up a certain amount of money and they'd be matched by the federal government and matched with it. That's all gone. What's replaced with is essentially a system of 2 block grants. One for child care and one for everyday health, which includes cash aid, work and training assistance, and the like. And though we'll talk in a moment about a variety of restrictions that are supposedly placed on them, when the dust settles, if you're clever, there are almost no rules about how you spend this money. And the one bit of good news here is there's actually more money in these block grants than would have been spent in the absence of the block grants had nothing happened. And in New York State, there's a fair amount more money. $80 million more in child care than otherwise would have been spent. That's, by the way, almost 80% more than the projected use for federal. At least $400 million more in the program for AFPC and the other. So, which is like 20% more. So there is more money. The definition of who you help is entirely up to you. You can help families in any way you want. You can spend all your money on vocational training if you want. You can spend all your money on AFPC-like benefits. You can redefine families. You can define it any way you want. You can have a program just for kids. The other thing it says is everybody, you have to cut people off after 5 years. And that is something that's quite disturbing. Whether or not they have a job, whether or not they've been able to find anything, there is some exemptions allowed. Bottom line on that is it's very, very troubling. I've always, by the way, I'm not at all troubled by having a program where ultimately people are expected to do it. I think work has got to be the orientation and the focus of where we go. And indeed, the original Clinton bill was a 2 years and you work bill. It said after 2 years, you've got to go to work. The previous 2 years, in some cases it's longer, but previous 2 years you get work and training and a variety of other things. But after 2 years, you've got to go to work. But if there were no jobs available, you would have to be, one would be provided for you. You take a welfare check and create a subsidized job of some sort. That's not here at all. There's nothing here about subsidized jobs. No encouragement for putting in nothing. And cutting people off after 5 years, you're cutting off a group of people that is likely to have an extraordinary job. Obviously, the most important thing is to focus on work. The fact of the matter is that everyone believes in work. Everyone wants to be working. Everyone wants to be in the labor market in some fashion. And this is an opportunity to really make the focus of that. I spend a lot of time in the welfare office. And what I see almost always makes me angry and upset and frustrated. Because again, we're in the check writing business. We ought to be in the business of helping people help themselves. And make no mistake, changing the culture of welfare offices is going to be unbelievably hard. It is not what people want to do. They are used to taking forms and filling out forms. That's what we do for a living, those of us in the welfare system. Doing that is going to you've got to change welfare offices from something that's about eligibility, check writing, and fraud, and detection of fraud, into something that's about supporting working folks. That, I think, has both the political capacity as well as the intellectual cap to make it work. That means child care for working families. We've got a big increase in the child care budget here. Why not make sure any working poor family really has access to child care? It's an obvious place to start. Obviously, medical care. What a crazy system that says the only people with secure medical care in this country are the non-working poor and the well-to-do. What message is that sending? It's got to be nuts. And there's lots of things we can do. We can supplement wages and things like tax credits and the like. We have now a flexible pool of money that really can be starting to focus on work. And if we start there and work from there, I think we can do something. In addition, we've got to be in the job creation business. It's something of a bugaboo. But the fact of the matter is, for a lot of folks, they're not going to be ready to find jobs, or the jobs aren't going to be there. So we can use this in various ways. You got to work very closely with the unions. You got to work very closely with a lot of folks. But somehow or other, there's a lot of things that aren't getting done in our communities, and if you use this money to create jobs, you can do it. Third, we've got to be in the education business, obviously, but in a very thoughtful and careful way to find the kind of training and education that leads directly and quickly into jobs. Finally, and this is the hardest thing for a group of advocates always to get behind, we've got to track people and evaluate. The best lesson, the best information we're going to have is going to be following what happens to people. If they do get cut off, if we do adopt time limits, what happens to people? Do they in fact get jobs, or are they on the street? If we don't have that kind of information, it will be dueling, press clips, dueling sound bites. If you carefully track folks, we may discover that some folks do make it, and finding out how they make it will be very helpful. And we'll also find out who doesn't make it. And if the news turns out to be good, and most people do find a way in, we can focus on the people that don't. And if the news turns out to be bad, and a lot of people are really in trouble, then we can use that and say, look, 75% of the folks that got cut off are down in a homeless shelter. Is that what you had in mind? I honestly believe the public doesn't have that in mind. They want a system about work and responsibility. Finally, don't forget child support enforcement. There really is an awful lot out there in the way of potential support from non-custodial parents to custodial parents. There are problems, but there's a lot to be done. This new bill has a lot of good stuff. Bottom line, work. Make it about work. I think that's a political winner. It's also what the clients I deal with, and I assume most of you deal with, know it's got to do with that. But second of all, don't fool yourself. This bill is not going to get fixed.
By the year 2002, the work participation requirement grows from 25 to 50%, and the numbers to be placed grows to more than 100,000. So by the year 2002, over 100,000 people will have to be placed in jobs, or will have to be eliminated from the welfare rolls. These statewide requirements have serious implications for New York. New York accounts for about 70% of the AFDC caseload. Currently, there are some 786,000 persons in New York City who receive AFDC, and 276,000 of them are adults. This represents 1 in every 9 city residents. Now, the implications are very serious for us in New York for many reasons. I just would like to underscore the issue of New York's job market and its prospects for employment. Although nationally we have seen a major reduction in unemployment, national rates just over 5%. New York City, the unemployment rate is over 8%. The other serious problem we have in New York is that New York is not producing jobs. The rate of job growth in New York is 1/2 the national average. Interestingly enough, the mayor, the governor will tell you, a report that I put out last week show that New York State, for instance, at the present time, at the midpoint in the fiscal year, New York State's revenue is running at about $300 million above what was expected at this time. That's the good news. We're having a lot of revenue. The bad news is all of that revenue is basically coming from one industry, from the financial services industry. Wall Street is producing immense revenue at the present time, but the very industry that's producing revenue is not producing jobs. Jobs are actually shrinking in that very same industry. So the problem with that is that it's producing revenue, isn't producing jobs, and where we are becoming dependent on one particular industry to provide most of our revenue, if there is a downturn or even a leveling off in that particular industry, we look at a very serious dislocation. So that's the job picture that we're looking at as we think about this issue of moving people from welfare into work. We can wait until the legislature begins to deal with the plan, and then we can react to it, hoping to modify it somewhat. Or we can move forward using the resources of advocacy groups here, particularly the resources of the Community Services Society, and we can begin to shape what we think a reasonable, rational, compassionate plan might be. Recognizing the huge problems, particularly the problem of how are we going to engage the private sector? If jobs are going to be created, the only place those jobs can be created is in the private sector. And we've already mentioned the present situation with respect to the workforce in New York City and New York State. And in spite of that, how can we convince the private sector that they have a stake in this? That the future of this city, its economy, the quality of its life will be determined by the success of this plan. How do we convince them of that, and how do we engage them in the process of working to provide jobs for people? And we know very little about the characteristics of this workforce. How many of them are ready for work? How much training will they have? We do know this. We've audited training programs now carried on by various both private and public agencies in the state, and none of them work. Most of them do not do what we've just heard. They don't track what happens to the people who participate in the programs. They cannot tell you what happens to the people that they have involved in so-called training programs for people who are on welfare who were supposed to move to work. They just don't know. So how can we now work with the private sector? And how can we, in some way, encourage them to develop with us meaningful training programs and put people to work? But I want to emphasize that the one opportunity we have is to work with the Democrats in the Assembly who will be a party to the process of the final approval of some plan. And that's a daunting task for them. But I believe if we work with them and provide assistance to them in terms of the collective experience we have in the advocacy and the service community, perhaps we can find some answers to this very serious problem.
The major concern of many in this audience and elsewhere is the 5-year time limits. Is there any way New York State can protect those people who experience extensive barriers to work, or those who are working and receiving very little cash assistance from that 5-year limit? And how do we work with that?
David, I want to get to that question, although I do also want to suggest that there's an important aside here. My mother-in-law used to work for CSS once upon a time.
That's why it was so easy to get this panel.
The question that you're asking is really the question that makes folks very nervous. What happens at the end of the federal time limit? What happens after 60 months? What's important to appreciate is that there are ways of safeguarding and protecting people, and I'd like to address those. First, what we need to understand is the simple sentence that the 60-month time limit is a time limit that applies to receipt of federal TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the replacement for AFDC program. So what's important in that sentence is first that it's the TANF program assistance. TANF is important because you can play with that word a little bit. You can talk about how it's TANF and all the different conditions that you can attach to it. But also what's significant is that it's the federal money to which the time limit applies. The time limit does not apply to state monies. The time limit does apply to assistance. What's important here is to appreciate that the word assistance applies to any kind of assistance, not just cash assistance as we're traditionally used to thinking of the welfare system as grants, but anything else that we might create with this new funding stream, this general revenue sharing scheme. If you pay for the assistance, whether it's a counseling program, a transportation program, out of the federal TANF monies, then the clock will tick. 60 months of federal TANF assistance is what you're limited to. Now, before you get real nervous about the word assistance, let me mention one aside here, which is child care. Child care was pulled out and put into, as David was mentioning, a block grant, the Child Care and Development Block Grant. The clock does not tick on the Child Care Development Block Grant. It would tick if you provided child care assistance using TANF monies, which for some reasons you might wish to decide to do. But one of the issues is to recognize that the clock is ticking when you do. Now, the reason that we're all concerned about the time limit and what happens to folks when they hit it, is that we are aware that for certain populations, the expectation of work is a tough expectation, and that is the group that have the greatest barriers, multiple barriers to work, and that is as well the group of low-wage workers who are in and out of the taxable workforce, which is many in the current AFDC caseload. And it is well, in this world where the clock ticks on assistance, apply to low-wage workers, our success stories, when they receive assistance under the federal TANF program. There's another vehicle which we need to explore, and that's the one about the state dollars, because the clock, as I said before, does not tick on the state dollars. So a structural question, as states look at this money, is how they create their funding streams, how they put their federal dollars and distinguish from them state dollars. Now, before I take you a little bit on this bumpy road of explaining these distinct federal and state streams, I think what's most important is what both of these speakers were saying here, which is that first, we need to figure out what is most sensible, what we want to achieve, what we would do with these new dollars, what we would do with revenue sharing by way of an affirmative approach. And then let's see where overlaying the constraints and overlaying the advantages, disadvantages of different funding streams and make it fit as much as possible into those.
One of the greatest challenges you face is if you're going to say, back up. First of all, you've got to avoid getting to the time limits followed by nothing frame of mind. If that's where you end up, you're going to have real trouble. Instead, you got to be in time limits followed by work, with some requirement that work be provided. And let me explain why that's important to start with. That's important not only because it's protection for people who are willing to work but can't find jobs. It also is the best way I know to get the welfare bureaucracy to start changing, because the hardest thing in the world is, in fact, to create jobs. In Florida, as part of their waiver request, the federal government insisted that anybody that couldn't find a job at the end of 2 years had to be given one. Guess what? They're going crazy trying to find people jobs in the first 2 years. They don't want to have to create any jobs. Okay? So the fact that it's hard, if you use it right, can actually be leveraged to make the system to try and do the right thing in terms of placing people into work, rather than the wrong thing in terms of just throwing people in this. So that's item one. Item two is, there are 2 or 3 ways you do it. First of all, you really do clearly got to work both with the private sector and the unions. And in fact, I think this is one where I am moved by some of the discussion to say, you know, there are some private sector groups that may be in a better position than public sector groups to do this. And let me just explain why. I've sat in many meetings with businessmen to talk about this, and they almost always say, we really are willing to help, but keep your red tape out of my face, send me people that really know how to work, and so forth. And then, you know, the welfare officials often then start talking about funding streams, complicated rules, this and that, and so forth, and they talk a different language. A good job placement firm will pay a lot to a good job placement specialist. In the welfare office, that'll probably be one of the less well-paid persons. So some way of combining that. So I worked very closely with the private sector. I'd set up a variety of groups, and I'd try, and I'd experiment like crazy. That's the other thing. There is no right answer. You can't point to a wildly successful program around the country. I wish you could. But if you insisted on the one hand that you were going to have to provide jobs for people, and gave a lot of flexibility even at the local level, and did some experimentation and so forth, I think it's our best hope. Because the fact of the matter is we have created jobs in large numbers. We did under CETA. We certainly did under the WPA. There certainly is an infrastructure problem in this city. I noticed it coming here. There are lots of opportunities to add value. And in the end, the way it works is going to depend very heavily on each local community.
Forget about employing people in the public sector. New York City in the last 2.5 years has reduced its public workforce by 29,000 workers. So that's not the place where we're going to place people. So we've got to engage the private sector, and that will be difficult.
What's going to happen to low-wage workers generally if this goes wrong? We already have large numbers of people who are not receiving any public assistance, but are sort of without benefit jobs at or a little above the minimum wage. What happens to that population if there's suddenly, I think this was actually referred to in one of the statements, as an enormous cohort of people come into this economy, competing for an increasingly scarce commodity? Jodie, I think, do you have any ideas of what this, how do you quantify this? What do we do?
It actually has been quantified by the Economic Policy Institute, which took a look at what would happen if everybody kept their jobs and added on 1 million new workers. What would be the depressing effect on wages? And I'm going to turn to Dave to see if he can help me, because I seem to remember a 17% decline. Yes, thank you. Who shall I credit? CSS, of course I knew that without even asking.
Join the board too.
There you go. A 17% decline amongst low-wage laborers from their current low wages. So it's knowable that if indeed there's this success, concomitant with the success is this side effect.
There is. In a lot of cases, we're talking about one parent who's being expected to do the job that the society often asks two to do, nurture and provide for a child. That's really tough. So that means child care and the like is really critical. But it also means that a second source of income, not a welfare source, is really critical. And one strategy that, in fact, there have been a variety of experiments done here, it's called the CAP program, but a variation on the strategy is, say, suppose you don't collect enough child support. How about guaranteeing some minimum level of child support that the custodial parent can count on? It's kind of like an insurance. It's kind of like unemployment insurance, only it's child support insurance, so that they can count on a certain level, and it comes in every month, no matter what. Then that plus a job and some child care and so forth suddenly becomes feasible. And it doesn't turn out to be very expensive, and I think it's one way you can also do it. The final element that we didn't do enough of, we had some experiments, but one I would urge you to look very hard at. When you're in this difficult situation of saying, look, it's hard to create jobs, it's hard to get a bureaucracy to work on the one hand with the private sector, other bureaucracy on the other, and the kinds of problems we've already mentioned. It turns out, even in a place like New York City where the unemployment rate is higher and so forth, huge numbers of people do in fact leave welfare and go to work. Overwhelming majority of people leave welfare for work in the first 2 or 3 years. The problem is most of them come back. Huge fraction, like 70 or 80% leave within the first 2 to 3 years, and 75% of them come back. Well, a really obvious place to start is to figure out why those people are coming back, and if there isn't a way to keep them from coming back. Then you don't have to create jobs. You're in a matter of protecting jobs, protecting people in those jobs. Sometimes they come back because they don't have child care, strong child care. Sometimes they come back because they don't have the medical care they need. Sometimes they come back maybe because they don't know quite what to expect in the job market, and they need some support for that. But whatever the reason, it's a whole lot easier to help people stay at a job than it is to create a job.
With a welfare population of 2 million, which is more than the number of residents in greater Miami, or many states for that matter, New York has a lot at stake. If the legislature and governor craft a carefully thought-out plan that is both fiscally sound and supportive of people in need, we can achieve real welfare reform. However, if it's business as usual in Albany, not only welfare recipients, but the rest of us as well, will be feeling the fallout for years to come. This is David R. Jones for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.